March 15, 2003, United Center, Chicago, 7:47 p.m. The temperature inside the arena sits at precisely 68 degrees, the kind of climate-controlled precision that allows sweat to emerge as soon as movement begins. The crowd noise is the particular fever of a Saturday evening game in March when the regular season has worn down to its final weeks and stakes no longer feel abstract but concrete, survival level urgent. The court is immaculate, the lines crisp and white against the maple, the scoreboard already showing the teams warming up with 34 minutes until tip-off. Outside the arena, March snow falls on Michigan Avenue, but inside this cathedral of sport, 50,000 people are gathering to witness what would become the most significant moment in Michael Jordan's final season as a professional basketball player. The Miami Heat have traveled north to Chicago, and they arrive as genuine contenders, their confidence elevated by their roster and their record, and more specifically by the young guard who has been operating as the psychological center of their offensive universe. But something about this night will expose the gap between what a young athlete believes about himself and what Michael Jordan understands about the actual geography of dominance, the unwritten laws of sport that cannot be found in any coaching manual but must be discovered through decades of relentless competition and the specific willingness to transform humiliation into fuel. The arena itself carries the weight of Jordan's history embedded in every surface. Every corner of the United Center had witnessed moments of his greatness. Thousands of nights when he had walked from the locker room tunnel and had immediately established dominance through some combination of talent, intelligence, and an almost supernatural ability to understand what his opponents were about to do before they did it. The building seems to remember this. The very air seems weighted with anticipation, with the knowledge that an old king is in final residence, that the end is approaching, and that every game now carries the texture of goodbye. The crowd has begun to arrive early, understanding that they are in the presence of something that is about to vanish, something that cannot be replicated once it is gone. There is a particular kind of grief that comes to sports fans when they understand that they are watching the final act of something magnificent, and that grief was already present in the arena at 7:47 p.m. on a Saturday evening in March, creating an atmosphere charged with the recognition that history was about to happen. Dwyane Wade, 21 years old in his second professional season, already carrying the unmistakable posture of someone being shaped by destiny into something larger than a local story. The statistics alone establish his presence, averaging 19 points per game in a season that would define his ascent, shooting above 40% from the field, running the Heat's offense with a confidence that his coaches had encouraged and his teammates had begun to mirror back to him as though he were the sun and they were planets establishing orbit around his potential. The NBA had begun to whisper about Wade in the way it whispers about young players who appear to have arrived at some understanding of the game that usually takes a decade longer to access. The media, in the manner of media everywhere, had amplified this whisper into something approaching prophecy, something that felt like destiny rather than possibility. Wade, in interview after interview leading into the Chicago game, had begun to make remarks about his own potential that were technically not disrespectful, but carried within them the kind of casual certainty that functions as disrespect, without the grammar of disrespect, the way a young bull can acknowledge the age of the old bull while still making it clear that he has begun calculating the precise moment when the transition becomes inevitable. The Heat Media Guide had referred to Wade as the future of the franchise. ESPN had created graphics showing his trajectory compared to guards from previous eras, had commissioned segments in which analysts discussed whether this young player might possess the kind of all-around game that would define the next decade of basketball. The context then was this: a brilliant young player, operating inside the normalization of his own excellence, arriving in Chicago to face the ghost of something that was about to disappear forever, arriving with the unconscious confidence of someone who has not yet learned that confidence is a liability unless accompanied by knowledge earned through repetition and failure, and the humbling encounters that teach true wisdom. Michael Jordan, at 40 years old, operates according to a physics that no longer exists in the younger generation's understanding of professional sport. He is in his 21st season, having returned from retirement 2 years earlier, and his body has become a kind of archaeological site where different eras of his career can still be excavated if one knows where to look. The thing about aging athletes who remain at elite levels is that they understand something that younger players cannot yet perceive. They are not the same animal they were, but they have become something else entirely. Jordan at 40 is operating at a different frequency than Jordan at 32. But the frequency is precision rather than volume, efficiency rather than explosiveness, calculated movement rather than athletic explosion. In practice that week, in the lead-up to the Miami game, Jordan had moved with the particular economical grace of someone who has played enough basketball that the game no longer requires his full conscious attention to operate. There is a photograph from the locker room before the game where Jordan is taping his wrists in the precise manner he has performed this ritual perhaps 5,000 times before, and his face carries the expression of someone engaged in meditation rather than preparation. His teammates had learned to read the grammar of his presence, the way he fell silent in the hours before a game, the way his jaw set in a particular configuration when something had been said to him that had registered as a minor insult, the way his stare could make someone uncomfortable from across a locker room without him ever turning his head to establish the actual contact. There was something in his eyes on that March afternoon that suggested he had heard something, that something had been said or written or transmitted to him that had registered in that particular place where Michael Jordan stored information about disrespect, real or imagined, the place where he kept his purpose and his fuel, and his reason for continuing to play basketball at an age when most athletes had retreated to television booths and golf courses. What Wade had done in the hours before the game, what he had said to the Miami Herald reporter, and what had been transcribed and transmitted across the sports journalism apparatus with the speed of modern communication, was to make a comment about Jordan's age that was framed as acknowledgement but functioned as erasure. He said something like, and multiple sources recorded variations of this phrase that subtly altered the meaning but maintained the essential message, that the game today was different than it was back when Jordan was in his prime, that the athleticism required was a different kind of beast, that the speed of play had accelerated beyond what the old generation had experienced, that he was not sure how those old superstars would adjust if they were starting their careers now. He had been careful enough not to say Jordan by name. He had been careful enough to frame it as a general observation rather than a specific challenge. But everyone understood that the comment was aimed at the man who would be defending against him for 48 minutes that evening. The man who had already heard variations of this sentiment throughout his career whenever a young player arrived and needed to construct a narrative in which the old architecture of dominance no longer applied because the world had evolved and he had not. The media had run with the comment. Analysts had debated whether Wade might have a point. The narrative had been established. The old king facing the new generation, speed versus experience, youth versus age, the future confronting the past, the inevitable march of time that no athlete could resist. The comment had made its way to Jordan, as such comments always did in those days before social media had accelerated the dissemination of every minor utterance. In those days, information moved through the sports world with the speed of light, journalists and broadcasters and team personnel all ensuring that every disrespectful word spoken by one player about another would eventually reach the ears of the player being disrespected. It was a feature of the system, perhaps even a necessary feature, a way of ensuring that old rivalries were constantly refreshed, that the narrative of sport maintained its dramatic tension, that players would have reasons to engage with each other beyond the simple desire to win a game. Jordan had received the information about Wade's comments without apparent reaction. He had been asked about it in practice, had given the kind of non-answer that suggested he had not heard it or did not care about it, but everyone who knew him understood that the information had been filed away in that particular section of his consciousness where he stored debts, slights, challenges to his authority. The philosophy of Michael Jordan, the foundational principle that had animated his entire career since he was a young player himself, was that disrespect was an opportunity, that a young player saying something foolish was actually offering him a gift, a reason to respond in the language he understood best, the language of performance, the language of dominance expressed through the medium of basketball, the only language that truly mattered. The game began at 8:15 p.m., and for the first 2 minutes and 47 seconds of the first quarter, Dwyane Wade had been entirely correct about his own excellence and his own capabilities. He had scored 8 points, using the kind of explosive athleticism that had made the media comparisons to younger versions of greater guards seem almost conservative in their ambitions. He had moved around the court with the particular confidence of someone who had been told repeatedly that he was the future, and he had begun to inhabit that role with the unself-consciousness of youth. The Chicago crowd had quieted slightly, the way crowds quiet when they realize they are watching something that requires their respect regardless of which team it represents. But then something shifted, and the shift was almost invisible if one was not paying close attention to the specific angle of Jordan's shoulders. The way his eyes had changed when Wade had beaten him on a crossover dribble in the first half and had looked back at him with the expression of someone registering that they had just won a small battle, had established a small victory that suggested future victories might be possible. It was the look of someone who did not yet understand that he had been allowed to win this small victory, that the old player had permitted it to happen so that the young player would develop the confidence necessary to attempt something much larger, something far more ambitious, something that would expose him completely. Jordan was calculating. Jordan was teaching. Jordan was setting a trap that would close in the third quarter. In the third quarter, at 3 minutes and 15 seconds remaining in the period, Wade had gone directly to the basket against Jordan, had driven the lane with the same acceleration that had worked throughout the game, had loaded up for a layup that would give him his third consecutive bucket and extend the Heat's lead to 6 points. What happened in that sequence was that Jordan, instead of fighting over the screen or attempting to draw a charge or reacting with desperation, had simply placed his body in the precise vertical space where Wade's ascent would require him to exist, had positioned himself not with explosive athletic movement but with the kind of calculated placement that suggested he had already anticipated Wade's decision 3 full seconds before Wade had made it. The contact between them had been absolutely legal by the rules of professional basketball, but absolutely destructive by the rules of human physics. Wade had gone down hard, had slid across the floor underneath the basket, and had risen slowly, understanding in that moment what older athletes understand when they realize they have encountered something their physical gifts cannot overcome, because they are encountering someone who has been teaching this specific lesson for a career that is measured in decades. Someone who has learned that the brain is stronger than the body, that positioning is superior to athleticism, that the man who understands the game 3 steps ahead of everyone else on the court will always win in the end. The collision was not violent. It was elegant. It was beautiful. It was absolutely, utterly devastating. The immediate aftermath of any confrontation in sport is often the most revealing of true character and true understanding. Wade had gotten up, had brushed his shorts, had retreated back toward the Heat's half-court line, but his entire physical carriage had changed. His shoulders had rounded slightly. His eyes, which had been bright and focused throughout the first 3 quarters, had acquired a kind of cautious distance from the action, as though his nervous system had suddenly filed a report about its own limitations, about the existence of a ceiling he had not known he possessed. Jordan had simply turned away, had not looked at Wade, had not needed to look at Wade, had begun moving back toward the defensive end with the appearance of someone who had just accomplished something that required his full attention for perhaps 8 seconds and could now return to the other thoughts that occupied his consciousness. The thing about true dominance is that it does not require celebration, because celebration implies doubt about whether the message has been received, and Jordan had never doubted whether the message was received. It was always received. It was received in the nervous system. It was received in the part of the brain that processes threat. It was received in the place where philosophy meets biology, where understanding meets the body's ability to execute understanding. It was received by Wade, and everyone in the arena and everyone watching on television understood that something had just happened, something fundamental, something that would redefine how a young player understood his own place in the hierarchy of the game. Wade had been taught. The lesson had been delivered. What happened after that 8-second sequence was that the Heat's entire offensive system began to deteriorate like a building losing its structural integrity. Wade, in the remaining 18 minutes of the game, would score only 4 more points. He would take forced shots from distance that did not fall, would make poor decisions about when to attack and when to pull back, would become increasingly tentative, would become a secondary actor in his own game. The Chicago crowd would rise to their feet, would understand that they were watching a public lesson in the actual cost of confidence that is not yet rooted in sufficient experience, that they were witnessing the moment when a young athlete's self-image collided with reality, and reality won decisively. The scoreboard would tell the story. Chicago 95, Miami 81, final. The final margin of victory would be 14 points, would be comfortable, would be the kind of victory that does not require heroics or luck. But the scoreboard is always the least interesting part of any contest. The interesting part is what happens inside the consciousness of the player who believed one thing about himself and then encountered evidence that contradicted that belief with the kind of evidence that cannot be rationalized away or contextualized or explained as a bad game or an off night or simply a difference in matchups. The evidence had been precise. The evidence had been delivered in 8 seconds. The evidence had been given the form of a physical encounter that was absolutely legal and absolutely humiliating. Wade understood. Everyone understood. The locker room after the game is where Wade sits for 12 minutes before he showers, still in his uniform, staring at the floor in a way that suggests he is not actually seeing the floor, but rather seeing something interior that has just reorganized itself according to new information, new data that has arrived to contradict all his previous assumptions. His teammates had given him space, had understood without needing to be told that this was not a moment for consolation or statistics or the usual apparatus of post-game rationalization. There is nothing to say in these moments. The game has spoken for itself. The message has been delivered. Further words would only diminish the clarity of the message. What Wade would carry forward into his career from that night was not the scoreboard, but the memory of the instant when his understanding of his own trajectory had collided with another player's understanding of dominance, and the collision had produced clarity. The kind of clarity that comes only when someone finally understands that they have been operating from a fundamentally incomplete understanding of their own sport. Some players, when they encounter this moment, become bitter, become obsessed with revenge in a way that distorts their play, become trapped in an emotional response that prevents them from learning the lesson. Some players learn from it in the right way, in the way that Wade eventually would, by understanding that excellence is never about whether you are young and talented, but about whether you understand the specific cost that excellence demands, and how much of that cost you are willing to bear over a career, over a lifetime. By the end of that night, Wade had begun to understand that cost, had begun to recognize that being an athlete and being an excellent athlete are two different things, that the gap between them cannot be bridged through natural talent alone, that the gap exists only in the realm of discipline, commitment, willingness to work on things that do not show up in the statistics. In the Chicago locker room, Jordan had showered, had dressed, had spoken to the media with the particular minimum of language that he employed on nights when he had been forced to make a point through demonstration rather than conversation. A reporter had asked him about the play, about the sequence with Wade, and Jordan had said something that had the appearance of modesty, but was actually pure philosophy, that the young guy was talented, that he would learn from tonight, that the important thing in basketball is understanding that there is a difference between being able to play and understanding how to win, and that understanding how to win is something that cannot be taught through statistics or media exposure or even physical gifts. It has to be taught through the specific experience of encountering someone who has decided that a particular game, a particular moment, a particular young player is worth using as a classroom. Jordan had said something else, something that had appeared in various reports but always with slight variations. Something like, maybe the game has changed, maybe kids today are faster than they were before, maybe the athleticism is different, but the fundamental principle has not changed. Will never change as long as basketball is played. The player who understands that his mind is more valuable than his body wins. The player who keeps himself in control when everyone around him is operating from fear wins. The player who has studied the game deeply enough to know what is about to happen before it happens will always win. That is the only evolution that matters, the only change that makes any difference, the only thing worth talking about. The night itself passed into memory, became part of the broader narrative of Jordan's final season. A season that would end in the first round of the playoffs and would constitute the last time the world would watch Michael Jordan play professional basketball in an NBA uniform. The specific game against Miami would not become famous in the way that some games become famous. There would be no ESPN 30 for 30 documentary dedicated to it. It would not appear in the highlight reels that played on loop in the years after his retirement. But for Dwyane Wade, for the Heat organization, For everyone who understood basketball at a level deeper than statistics, this night would function as a pivot point, a moment of transformation that separated the before from the after. Wade would not forget the 8-second sequence. He would not forget the way it felt to understand, in the space of a few seconds, that confidence is not the same as preparation, and that youth is an asset only when combined with wisdom about one's own limitations, about the existence of people and principles that supersede your own potential. In the years that followed, Wade would become one of the great guards in basketball history. He would reach an NBA Finals, would win a championship, would establish himself as a legitimate all-time talent. But he would always understand, in the part of him that had developed through that game against Jordan, that excellence is not about being the best athlete or having the most gifts. Excellence is about being willing to work on the invisible aspects of your game. Your mental clarity, your decision-making, your understanding of how to maintain composure when the narrative around you is telling you that you are invulnerable, that you have already arrived, that your journey is essentially complete. Wade would face many opponents after Jordan retired, would dominate many games, would accumulate victories and accolades, and the kind of recognition that comes to great players. But he would never quite forget the night when a man 40 years old had used his body and his intelligence to deliver a message that said, "I am still here, and you do not yet understand what it means to be here at this level. You have not paid the price that is required to truly inhabit excellence." The larger philosophical principle operating in this story is that the body is a tool and the mind is the toolmaker, that the brain always wins against the body if the brain has been developed with sufficient sophistication. Jordan had spent 2 decades learning how to translate his will directly into physical action, how to use his body in ways that were not about looking impressive but about being effective, how to move without wasting energy, how to position himself in ways that made everything easier, more efficient, more dominant. By the time he reached 40, he had accumulated such a library of knowledge about how to move, how to position himself, how to anticipate, that he no longer required the same volume of athleticism he had needed at 25. He had become more like a chess player than an athlete, someone for whom each movement had been calculated according to principles learned through repetition and study. Wade, at 21, was still discovering the game, still operating largely from athletic gifts, still believing that physical ability could overcome knowledge, that speed could overcome understanding, that youthful explosion could overcome decades of accumulated wisdom. What the 8-second sequence had taught him was that there is a moment in every athlete's development when they realize that pure athleticism has limits, and the only way to transcend those limits is to begin the long process of learning how to think while your body is in motion, how to make decisions in conditions of extreme pressure, how to convert pain into purpose, how to transform humiliation into fuel for future excellence. Excellence is achieved through the specific combination of natural talent, relentless work, strategic intelligence, and the willingness to embrace a philosophy in which past humiliation becomes fuel for future performance. Jordan, by the time he was 40, had learned this equation through decades of practice, through countless nights when he had dominated, through countless nights when he had been dominated, and had extracted every possible lesson from those nights. Wade, on that March evening in 2003, was just beginning to understand that such an equation existed, that excellence operated according to laws that could be learned and understood and systematized, that the path to greatness was not mysterious, but only required commitment and wisdom, and the willingness to encounter one's own inadequacy. The moment when Wade had gone down hard, when he had risen slowly, when he had understood in his nervous system that he had encountered someone operating at a different level of mastery, this moment was the moment when he began the process of transforming from a talented young player into a disciplined student of his own excellence. The seed had been planted that night, the seed of understanding that excellence is not something you are born with. It is something you become, something you build through a specific kind of work, a specific kind of commitment, a specific kind of willingness to embrace pain as a teacher. What remains in the aftermath is the recognition that excellence is always a form of education. The great athletes are the ones who understand this principle early in their careers and build their entire approach to sport around the mission of becoming someone who can learn from every encounter, who can extract wisdom from defeat, who can recognize when they have been outmatched in a particular dimension, and can commit themselves to the work of elimination that brings all aspects of their game into alignment. Jordan had been offering this education throughout his career, had been saying through the grammar of his play that there is a specific price to be paid for excellence, and the price is that you must never believe that you have already learned enough. The younger generation often fails to grasp this principle because they arrive in their fields so laden with external validation, so convinced of their own extraordinary nature by media and coaches and family members and social media algorithms that amplify their accomplishments and minimize their failures, that they mistake the beginning of their journey for something closer to completion. They do not understand that having gifts is the opposite of accomplishment, that having advantages is actually a liability, because it prevents them from understanding the necessity of work. When Wade rose from the floor that night, when he understood in his body that Jordan had just taught him something important, he had received a gift. The gift was not pleasant. The gift was not kind. The gift was the specific gift that only someone who has achieved mastery can offer, which is the gift of evidence that there is a difference between what you believe about yourself and what is true about yourself, and that the bridge between those two things is paved with work that you have not yet begun, with years of discipline and learning and failure and renewal that stretch out before you like a road with clear principles to guide the journey. The 8 seconds that defined that March night in Chicago are proof that the greatest form of power is not the power to win but the power to teach, not the power to dominate physically but the power to dominate spiritually, to create such absolute clarity about the difference between illusion and reality, that everyone who witnesses it understands that they have observed something essential, something that transcends sport and touches on the fundamental principles of human development. Dwyane Wade, in the aftermath of that game, became a better player not because he increased his vertical jump or his lateral quickness or added some mechanical element to his shooting form, but because he began to understand a principle that would have taken him decades to learn through any means other than direct confrontation with excellence. Every excellence is achieved through this process. Every person who has reached genuine mastery in any field has done so by being willing to encounter their own inadequacy repeatedly, has done so by seeking out teachers, has done so by understanding that the ultimate goal is not to arrive at a destination, but to remain engaged in a process of constant evolution. Jordan understood this. Wade, by the end of that night, had begun to understand this, and anyone who witnesses the story of how an old player dominated a young one, how experience defeated athleticism, how understanding overcame confidence, understands that the principle is universally applicable. The person who will win, in any domain, is the person who understands that the game has not yet been played, that there are always new skills to acquire, new aspects of reality to understand, new ways in which the universe is teaching them about their own limitations and their own potential. What happened in 8 seconds in Chicago on March 15, 2003, was proof that in any meaningful competition, what matters most is not what you have already achieved, but what you are willing to become.